day before Thanksgiving in 1971, a man identifying himself as Dan Cooper bought a plane ticket from Portland to Seattle. He hijacked the plane, claiming he had a bomb in his briefcase, and demanded $200,000 and 4 parachutes. He jumped out of the plane with the money and the bomb somewhere over the Pacific Northwest, never to be seen again. The FBI claims to have investigated over 1,000 people, including dozens of deathbed confessions. In 2016, 45 years after the hijacking, the FBI suspended its investigation of the case. While the FBI is no longer looking for D.B. Cooper, there is a community of people who are trying to solve the case on their own. Welcome to the Cooper Vortex. In case you folks haven't noticed, there are a lot of suspects in the D.B. Cooper skyjacking. Some suspects are better than others, some come and go, but there are some names that keep popping up when you research D.B. Cooper. One of those names is John List. John List is a name you may have heard before, especially if you really love true crime. I won't tell you anything else because our guest today can tell you all about him. In this episode, I'm honored to be joined by Joe Sharkey. Joe is a Vietnam veteran, spent 20 years writing for the New York Times. He's a professor and author of 5 books. One of those books is Death Sentence, the inside story of the John List murders. Joe and I get into why John List is and isn't a good fit for D.B. Cooper, and I had a really good time talking to him. Ladies and gentlemen, my good friend, Joe Sharkey. Joe, would you mind telling us who John List is?
Who John List was?
Who John List was, yes. That's a better way to put it.
Well, John List was an accountant by trade. He was a World War II veteran. He went in toward the end of World War II. After the war, he met a woman in Michigan where he had grown up and married her. He grew up in a very religious, strict household, a religious part of the Lutheran Church called the Evangelistic Lutheran Church. That was always extremely important to him. At any rate, when he got married, he was sort of a go-getter, except he constantly washed out of jobs. He had a degree from University of Michigan. He went to, I think the first job he had of any import was Xerox, in the early days of Xerox. And he went into a job and he was fine for a couple of years, and then everybody decided he couldn't keep up. And also people didn't like the guy. He was sort of, he was a mama's boy. He was kind of snippy, if you know what I mean. He wasn't pleasant. Some people liked him, but not very many people liked him. His wife was much livelier than he was. Her name was Helen List, and she liked to go out and drink, and she flirted, and he always sort of had a hard time accepting that. At any rate, John List went through his early adulthood as a married man, had 3 kids with Helen, and in the late 1960s, John, Helen, and John's mother, who was then in her 80s, moved to Westfield, New Jersey, which is sort of a very pleasant upscale suburban town, right across the river, not far from New York, an easy train ride into New York. John and Helen, his mother, were both very acquisitive, and they tended to live beyond their means, and they settled on a house in Westfield. Westfield has a lot of old mansions, and they settled on one that was available at a pretty good price. And it was, I think it was 17 rooms. It was a really substantial house. It needed a lot of work, but to them that was that was what they wanted to show the world that they were living in. It had a ballroom. It had beautiful chandeliers, and that's what they bought and moved in with the mother. The mother was the one who put the money up for the house, for the down payment. She lived in an apartment upstairs, and John and his 3 children, John, Helen, and his 3 children, there were 2 boys who were teenagers and a girl who was 16. Her name was Patty. They went to school. The kids went to school in Westfield, a really high class, a high achieving high school. And Patty who was now in her, her mid-teens, a lively girl who really was likable. Everybody liked Patty. A sweet kid. She got involved with the school and the community acting club, and Patty decided that she wanted to be in the theater. And John, being sort of extremely prudish and judgmental about these things, very, very conservative. I don't mean to bring religion too much into this because John was just a prig, if you know what I mean. He very much objected to Patty being enthusiastic about the theater. At the same time, remember, this is now we're now at the beginning of 1970. The Vietnam War is raging, and John was an arch conservative. He considered himself a combat veteran, but when I looked into his record, he didn't have much combat experience. He made a big deal of it, and he later claimed PTSD, but I just didn't buy that myself. At any rate, Patty was involved as young people were, peripherally in anti-war protests. Patty was, she had a peace symbol on her T-shirt, and John just thought this was horrible. He just thought this was shocking, and that to me was always one of the things that triggered John List's rampage. Was the daughter. She was. I knew a lot. I checked into her life and knew a lot about it from her friends. She wasn't. She wasn't a wild kid. She was. I don't think she was sexually involved. She had a boyfriend, but she was. She was a conservative kid. The wife was ill, and the wife Helen was increasingly bedridden, and John simmered about this, and he lost his job because once again he had a job at a bank in New Jersey. Once again, people didn't like him. His bosses didn't like him, and he was let go from that. But he didn't tell anybody that he was unemployed, and he did what I thought was a really strange thing. He always wore a coat and tie, often with a suit, and he would in the morning get up, put on his suit with a tie, and make his way either to the train station in Westfield, where he often spent the entire day until it was time to come home, or he would go into New York and sort of wander around New York. I think he hit Times Square porno parlors, but that really didn't come out very clearly in the afterwards.
It wouldn't surprise me if he did.
Yeah, that's exactly right. He was just exactly the type who would. That was where he would gravitate. At any rate, that's what he did. The debts are piling up. There's a foreclosure move by the bank on the house. He planned this he decided he was going to kill his family. He planned it for a while. John List was not a particularly bright. I mean, he appeared to be bright, but he was not all that bright, Darren, in my opinion. And I'm sort of an outlier on some of this stuff, but I researched it very well.
I've heard you say that before. If we could stop for just 1 second. I've heard you kind of say that in another interview that you don't want to refer to him as an intelligent man. What's your hesitation in that?
Well, okay, here's the hesitation is that's what people said. He couldn't adjust to innovations in the workplace. He read newspapers, definitely, and he considered himself an intellectual, but I just never, he was such a liar. I never bought that. And his well-laid plan, and you'll see other accounts of the John List story in which he has this brilliant, well-laid plan, and I just didn't see that. What I saw was a guy who, he put some things in place so that he could, number one, massacre his family. He had a gun that he'd had before in the basement of the house. And number two, so that he could escape. And here's where I think a lot of the misimpressions about John List come in. He did massacre his family, and I'll get to that in a minute. But his escape was not all that well planned, And I'm the one. I'm again an outlier on this. The police, the local cops, made a real big deal of how they searched hard for him, and how there was a national dragnet on John List. But there were places that you should have looked for John List immediately, and they didn't, and the FBI didn't as well. At any rate, we're now in November of 1971, He's really upset about Patty, the 16-year-old girl. She's in a play. She's in Little Abner, I think the high school play was, or the community play, and she plays the bombastic girl in Little Abner, whose name I forget. And she's on the stage in a bathing suit. Actually, the picture shows it's a very modest bathing suit, but he really flipped over that, and he had found a Ouija board in her room, and he decided that she was a Satanist. Something, a Ouija board that kids played with. I don't know if they still do, but they did in the 70s. Right. So she's a Satanist, right? She's nothing of the sort. She's just a kid. So he sets this plan, okay, and he carefully drains his mother's account. His mother had a good chunk of money in the bank, but he had been steadily draining it, and he drained the last of it. So he's got a couple of $1,000. He had the right to use his mother's account.
How long do you believe he had been planning this for?
Oh, I think the mother always, gave him money when he needed money, but I think he'd been steadily draining it for about a year because he was in debt. He was unemployed, and and the mother didn't have any. The mother didn't really keep track of the account. He was known as somebody that could come into the bank and take money out of the mother's account. At any rate, he has a couple of $1,000, right? Which is not a lot of money to, even in 1971 to escape and start a new life. But anyway, that's what he's got. He then lays this plan after a Halloween party that Patty and her friend, a girl, were dressed as witches. This again convinces John List that the girl is a Satanist and is involved with all sorts of nefarious activities, which she's not. He decides that he's going to massacre the family. He was going to do it on All Saints Day, which is right after Halloween, but then for some reason he decided that wasn't appropriate, and he waited another week. Now here's where, again, I am really an outlier on this one, but I know I'm right on this. John List, he did massacre the family one by one on the morning of November 9th, I think it was.
Yeah, November 9th.
November 9th. The girl comes home first from school. It's a snowy day. She comes home because school got out early, or she didn't feel well. She comes in and he's waiting. He's standing and wait. No, I'm sorry. I got the chronology wrong. First, he murders the wife. She comes down. The kids have gone off to school. She comes down in the morning for her coffee. He comes up behind her with a gun and boom, he blows her away. So he drags her down a hallway into a ballroom. This house actually had an old almost Victorian era ballroom. It was it was not in use, obviously. It had no furniture, but anyway, he drags her into this ballroom and leaves her in front of the fireplace on a sleeping bag. He had a couple of Boy Scout sleeping bags in the basement. He then makes breakfast and calmly. I guess he reads the paper. I mean, he starts to compose a letter to his beloved pastor explaining what he's about to do, and what he's done and what he's about to do. Patty comes home early afternoon. She's not feeling well from school. He sees her getting out of she gets a ride from school. He sees her getting out of a car. He hurries to the kitchen door with his gun, and she comes in. Boom! He kills her. He shoots her. He drags poor Patty into the ballroom on another sleeping bag, places her next to her mother. The two boys come home at separate times. Boom, boom, same thing. He shoots them in the head. One of the boys fought, but he didn't win. He drags them into the ballroom. Meanwhile, in the morning, after he shot the wife, the mother is upstairs. There's a big house, and the mother's in the upstairs part of the house. She yells out across the balcony, "John, is everything all right? I hear a noise." He decides that he'd already decided he was going to kill her, so he goes up and confronts the mother, tells her it was a car backfire, and boom, he shoots her, and he leaves her in her apartment on the third floor of the house. Later, he explains that he had to kill his mother to prevent her from being upset over what he'd just done. I hate to make this, I hate to laugh at that, but it's like, gee, this guy is really an amazing audacity. So now he's got the wife, the daughter, and the two boys dead on sleeping bags and one on a blanket in the ballroom, which is dimly lit. And he arranges the bodies, and the police made a big deal of this. And I'm not sure I didn't, but he does arrange the bodies in what you could argue was the form of a cross. Leaves them in the floor of the ballroom. He leaves the mother upstairs because he says later she was too heavy to carry down. He then he makes himself dinner. He finishes the letter to the pastor, in which he claims, it's a long and sort of self-pitying letter. It claims that he had to kill the family in order for them to go to heaven. What a sport!
Yeah,
and,
of course.
I mean, it's just he does mention that the daughter was drifting away from the church. She had long drifted away from the church, like a lot of kids did. And she was interested in the theater. He mentions that the debts were piling up, and this was the best solution he could come up with. And it's a 5-page letter, handwritten, that he leaves on the kitchen table. He then goes and has himself a good night's sleep in the mansion with the dead bodies in it. Gets up the next morning, makes himself breakfast. Of course, he always made sure he had a nice hearty breakfast, and puts on his suit and tie. He has a duffel bag with enough stuff to carry him along for a while, and he leaves the house. And he gets into the car, which is sort of a beat up car, and drives it to. It's now a very, very cold day, by the way. Drives it to Kennedy Airport, which is probably a hour's drive from Westfield, New Jersey, through New York traffic in the morning. He leaves the car at Kennedy Airport, and he leaves the keys and some identification in the car, so that when they find it, they'll know it was him. And when they find it, the police, they will presume that he got on an airplane and flew the coop, so to speak. He then goes from Kennedy, he gets a bus, and he goes to the Port Authority of New York bus station in Midtown Manhattan, and he gets on a bus. And that's the extent of his brilliant plan. Off he goes into thin air. Now, weirdly enough, he disappears for 18 years, and that's astonishing. And the police are, at a loss. They don't find the bodies for almost a month, because the list had made some phone calls telling the schools that the kids were going to go away for a while because there was a relative who was extremely sick and dying, and I think it was North Carolina. So he sets up this kind of weak alibi that the kids would be out of school for a while. He tells somebody at the bank that mother will be out of town because a relative is dying. And a month, that's a long time for kids to be missing in a town like Westfield. I mean, where people, know what other people are up to. So at this time, and here's where I'm really good on this story, and I don't think anybody else really understood this part of it. The kids in the high school drama class, Patty's friends, a week goes by and they're like, well, okay, that she had to go out of town, but nobody hears from her. And Patty stayed in touch with her friends, and the kids are starting to get worried. And the coach of the drama club, a sort of excitable guy named Ed Iliano, the former regional opera singer, and a guy who's very, very much involved in teaching kids about theater and putting on the local productions. He's worried. He's very worried. He's got a strange relationship with Patty, who he was obsessed with Patty because she was such a nice kid and she had talent. And as I got to know Ed later, I realized that he was guilty about the relationship he had with her, although I do not in any way believe that it was sexual. I think he was just too close to her, and it bothered him for the rest of his life. He approaches the cops. A couple of weeks have now gone by, and he says, "Look, but he's very nervous, right? Because he's just as nervous about this kid. There's something wrong here. The whole family is missing. There should be a truancy check on her. The cops, okay." So the cops send somebody out to the house. The house is locked up, of course. I think there were still some lights burning, but the cops have a look around, as cops will, and they ascertain that nothing appears to be wrong. So I think quite reasonably, the cops come back and they tell Ed, no, everything seems to be fine, and that's where it's left. But the high school kids are still increasingly worried. And here's where it gets really weird, in my opinion. Not only in my opinion, it just gets weird. The kids tell Ed, the drama school coach, we're going to go into the house. We're going to go up to the house and we're going to investigate. He says, no, don't do that. But some of the kids do that. They rattle the doors and all right. They can hear inside. They can hear music playing, but it's clear that nobody is in the house. So they come back and they brood for a while, along with Ed, who's brooding with them. And then one night in December, it's, I guess, 28 days after List has disappeared, has killed the family and disappeared, the kids impulsively go to the house. They say, "Oh, the heck with it. We're going to find out. Nobody's doing anything. The school's not doing anything. It's enough time." And they break into the house, which is easy enough to break into. The back shed door was the back mudroom door was loose. Now we have some teenage kids in a darkened house. The house, Lest had made sure to turn the thermostat way down in the house. In a darkened house in which there is music playing, because List had turned on the New York classical music station, which was the New York Times classical music station. He turned that on, and there were intercoms throughout the house, and he had that playing. So the kids are in this dark house with music playing, and they proceed very nervously to look around. It looks okay, but then one of them goes in the ballroom and with a flashlight sees the bodies, and the kids are just horrified. They don't know what to do. They flee because, number one, they're aware they're kids, and they're good kids, and they're aware, number one, they've broken into a house, they've broken and entered, and number two, they don't know what happened here, so they flee and they tell their drama club coach that they found bodies in the house, and that Patty was one of them. So I think it's 2 days later, or maybe a night later, he decides that he's going to go up himself and force this issue. He does with some of the kids, and he makes it's at night, and Ed Iliano, the drama coach, makes a big scene about going into the house. He goes in, he finds, to his utter horror, the bodies are there, just the kids, as the kids said, and he then makes a great clamor so that the neighbors are aware that there's been activity at the house. The neighbors call the cops. The cops arrive, and they come in with Ed leading the way, by the way, and the cops find the body. Now here is where it got pretty interesting here, because you got an intruder who's leading the cops into the house. So you've got a crime scene that is arguably, the crime scene is not pure yet. It's not pure. The cops then, and here's the Westfield police were lionized in some of the accounts. But if you look at what happened, the Westfield cops go, they go charging into the house, finding the bodies. Yeah. Photos are being taken. Somehow a local reporter is onto it, and when it goes out on the police scanner, more of the media show up, and you've got yourself really a bad scene. The cops find the letter that John List has written, and eventually they calm down the crime scene, And the story now is mild-mannered accountant massacres family of 3 children, wife and mother, and disappears because it's now been 28 days since John List disappeared into thin air. And that became the story. That was sort of the way it stayed for 18 years. John List mysteriously disappeared after this horrible crime that he had confessed to in the letter, so we know who did it. The Westfield being the kind of town where, like any small town, medium-sized town, people talk. There are rumors. There's lots of gossip, and of course, because of the at the time there was such commotion about Satanism that some of the rumors were that Satanists had broken into the house and somehow had killed the family, and John List somehow was murdered and taken out. So it's kind of crazy stuff that just got kicked around, and all this. A lot of time has gone by now, and nobody knows where John List is. Where the dickens did this guy go? So here we now. Here's where I think D.B. Cooper enters into it, because as you well know, D.B. Cooper is in the news 15 days after John List murders his family. Okay, there are similarities here because we know there are a lot of weird things about John List that, as the reporters talk to neighbors in Westfield. One of them is that John List is always in a suit and a coat and tie, often in a full suit and tie, a blue suit and a coat and and a blue tie. Even when he mows his lawn, that's a well-known thing about John List, who's considered very weird by his neighbors. D.B. Cooper is described as a guy wearing a suit and tie as when he goes to hijack this Northwest Orient airplane. The police have a picture of John List that's relatively recent that they put on the wanted flyers, and if you look at the sketch artist drawing of Dan Cooper, there's a great similarity between the two. They're middle-aged guys. Their faces are very similar. Their hairline is similar. You can make a guess that maybe there's a connection here.
Also, the murders took place on November 9th, and the hijacking took place on November 24th of the same year.
Yeah, that's right. On the same, not very long after, when it was known that John List, of course, was on the lam. He was missing. Whereas John List, look at this. John List may have somehow found his way to Portland, Oregon, and hijacked the plane and parachuted out at 10,000 feet into the wilds near Mount St. Helens. An assumption worth running down. But nobody has any other information. Realistically, John List was known that he was a schlub. He didn't have any aeronautical experience as D.B. Cooper certainly had. He was not the kind of guy to be jumping out of an airplane, although he was a guy that certainly could use $200,000. So anyway, there's that. Eventually, List is ruled out as being D.B. Cooper, and when he was finally asked about it 18 years later after he was captured, he sort of chuckled at the idea that would have been him. Where List actually went was he got on this bus in Midtown New York, and he went first to Michigan, and then he went directly to Denver, Colorado, where he did something that you could do in 1971 that you could never do today, and that was he carefully, and it was easy enough to do, created a new identity. Now, you could have done that then, but it seems to me that even then, the cops should have put together that you could only do that then in a big city, a relatively big city. And it was probably likely that if you were creating a new identity, you did it in a place where a lot of outsiders were coming. A lot of people were moving in from elsewhere in the country. Denver is one of those places. There are other places, Phoenix, etc. Denver is one of those places. And you had enough background on John List, his well-known obsession almost with this particular branch of the church, that you could assume that he would turn up in one of those churches. And it's not a very big number of that particular branch of the Lutheran Church. So I mean, you could have theoretically that would have been where you might look for John List. There was also at the time, though, remember it's the height of the Vietnam War. There was a lot of commotion about the FBI surveillance of churches were involved in some of the as being surveilled by the FBI. So there was a reluctance to look into a pretty obvious place, which would be churches. I just think the FBI notwithstanding, I just think that the cops in Westfield, New Jersey, really blew that case. There were, first of all, they should have been on the scene long before 28 days after the massacres. And afterwards they didn't really, it wasn't really good. They polluted the crime scene, and it wasn't really good police work. So it just left everything up in the air, so to speak, for a very long time. John List is out now in Denver, where his brilliant plan is he has a little bit of money, but it's not very much. He rents a trailer, he buys it actually, a little trailer in a trailer park beside the interstate, beside a Holiday Inn in Golden, Colorado, very near Denver.
Well, in Golden, that trailer right now would be worth $300,000.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. At the time, you could do that. You could rent, and not too many. It was still, it was a place where you could show up, and there were a lot of people coming in, and not just drifters, but people who were looking to start a new life. So you could show up, and there wouldn't be a lot of questions asked. There's also that sort of Western courtesy that you don't probe too deeply. And so he could, he gets a trailer. He buys a TV at Kmart or wherever you buy. He bought a cheap TV then, and he spies the Holiday Inn, which is a walking distance from the trailer park, and he just says, "Well, I gotta get a job." So he saunters over there, and because he had been cooking meals for the family that he murdered, because the wife was ill and bedridden. He talks himself into a job in the kitchen of the Holiday Inn, where he is befriended by the chef, who actually likes him, and he's also befriended by a sort of a cowboy who drifted in and out of Denver, who really decides that John List is okay. So he and the cowboy form an unlikely relationship as friends. Of the cowboy sort of, lets him know more of the ways of the West. At any rate, John List has, he gets it was easy enough to get a Social Security card. And once you had that, you get a phone. And once you had a couple of records, you could establish yourself in a new identity. And he's now calling himself Robert Clark, widower who came to Denver to start a new life. He joins exactly the same branch of the church because that was a huge part of his life. He's accepted there, of course, without any questions, which would make a lot of sense. At the church, after a couple of months, he meets a divorced woman who's very meek, named Dolores, and in a while he marries Dolores, who knows nothing. All she knows is that he's a widower, and his wife died tragically, which was certainly true. And he hooks up with poor Dolores, and they move together to a condominium in Denver, and live more or less happily ever after. But poor Dolores is stuck with John List, who behaves exactly like John List in Westfield, New Jersey. It's prickly. He's fussy. He's cheap. He's wheedling. But this is what Dolores has signed up for. And years go by, and he's living pretty much the same as he did in Westfield. But Dolores is working. I forget what Dolores did. And John finds a job as an accountant. He moonlights at tax period time with tax preparing company, and they just sort of roll along in a very sort of boring life in a condominium in Denver. He's in church. He's in the same church as Dolores, and that's where they are. So a lot of years have now passed, and John List occasionally, because on the anniversary of the killing in Westfield, he's taken to checking the Denver newspapers, which then had a lot of national news in them, and he years and years go by, and he sees no indication that anybody is onto him. There are the typical anniversary stories. X number of years have passed, and John List is still on the lam. But it really kind of fades away. I mean, it's a long time, 18 years. I guess by year 15, there happened to be a neighbor in this condominium, and one of my favorite characters in my book is a neighbor named Wanda Flannery, and she makes friends with her next door neighbor Dolores Clark, who now Bob Clark's wife, but she doesn't like Bob Clark, John List, and she can't put her finger on it, but she doesn't like the guy. He just gives off the wrong vibe to her. And one day in 1989, she had the habit of going to the supermarket and buying supermarket tabloid newspapers, which she told me she did because she just thought they were amusing. And she happened to be sitting at her kitchen table, reading the Weekly World News, which was then one of the the more sensational weekly tabloid newspapers, the kind with the aliens from outer space on the cover. But she sees on like page 17, there's a routine anniversary story. Whatever happened to John List? We're now coming up on the anniversary. It's just a routine story that here's a recap of what happened, and John List has disappeared into thin air. And there's a photo of John List, the same photo that's on the wanted posters. And Dolores, who doesn't like the guy next door, happens to be looking out the kitchen window, and she sees him taking out the trash. And she looks back at the picture in the newspaper, and she says, "Dang, that appears to be the same guy." And the description of him in the newspaper account sort of matched, about his characteristics. Frequently in a suit and tie, sort of fussy, all the things that were known about John List. She thinks that's the same guy. So, and she thinks, well, John List's story, Bob Clark's story, is that he was a widower and his wife died tragically. So Dolores, who does not like Bob Clark to begin with, goes, Wanda, who doesn't like Bob Clark to begin with, goes over to her friend Dolores. Bob is out of the house at this time. And she says, "Look, Dolores, honey, I think you should read this newspaper because I think this guy is your husband." And Dolores, who's very, very meek and very anxious, reluctantly reads the paper, and Dolores is horrified, but she rejects it immediately. And Wanda says, "Okay, I'm really sorry to have troubled you." And Wanda goes back to her house, and that's where it lay for not too long, because at the same time, some of the more enthusiastic young cops in the Westfield Police Department, where, of course, John List is already a legend, and he's the cold case of all cold cases in Westfield, a town which has had very few violent crimes, have decided that they're going to go to this TV show called America's Most Wanted, which I think was then becoming very well known. And they do try to approach America's Most Wanted, but they get rebuffed because the case is too old. There's no indication that anybody's going to find John List. but they keep pressing. To their great credit, they keep pressing on it, and finally I think they go to New York, as I recall, and they just barge in on an America's Most Wanted head producer, and say, you got to do this case because it's fascinating, and look at all the elements of it. The America Most Wanted people are like, I don't know, but finally they decide they'll do it, and they do a good job, recapping John List's life. They hire a forensic sculptor, somebody who does police forensic sculptures from Philadelphia, to use old photos of John List and to imagine to create a bust that looks like that would look like what they think John List would look like 18, 20 years later, with the eyeglasses and everything. And he does that.
And I would recommend right now, anyone listening to this, go look up that sculpture that was made. Because the guy just guesses what type of glasses he would have, how he would wear his hair, how he looked, and he got it dead on.
He was one of the best known police forensic sculptors, and he kind of got it. I mean, you look at it now, and you look at a picture of John List when he was arrested, and it's pretty close. I mean, that looks like John List. However, Wanda, who has been, she's been paying attention to this. She knows to watch this TV show. Wanda decides that sculpture doesn't look like John List, doesn't look like Bob Clark at all. I don't know what it was about the sculpture that turned Wanda off, but she decided, no, I was just a meddlesome old lady, and I have to just keep quiet. But there's a telephone number on America's Most Wanted, on where you call if you know where John List is, and of course that number attracts all kinds of false reports, and anybody who looks remotely like John List anywhere in the country has a problem because he's being fingered as John List. But the cops get dozens of tips, but they get the one from Wanda. They decide this one's worth checking out because she gives details and she gives an address of where Bob Clark lives. So the cops decide, well, all right, this is worth zeroing in on. We'll notify the FBI. Meanwhile, Bob Clark and his wife Bob got a new job in Virginia, so they've moved across the country. But of course, they have left their forwarding. Dolores left her forwarding address with Wanda. Dolores and Bob Clark have settled into Midlothian, Virginia, in a condominium there. He has a new job at an accounting firm. Again, it's an area that's rapidly growing. It's not terribly difficult to get a job as an accountant, and he gets one. And so he's working there, and they have rebuilt their lives very quickly in Midlothian, Virginia. The tip comes to the FBI district office there, and of course the FBI guys they're hard-bitten hard-bitten cops, and they're like, all right, we got to run this down. So among the ones they run down is John List is living at an ex address in Midlothian, Virginia. They go there. He's not home. They go to where he works, and they see this is the guy. So they collar him right then and there. He denies being John List, but he's caught. So he is hauled back to New Jersey for trial, still denying that he's John List. But finally, there's no doubt who he is. And he's tried for 5 counts of murder, convicted on all 5 counts, and sentenced to 5 life terms in prison. Off he goes. That's the end of the John List story. It's sort of where I got involved at the point where John List was arrested, and I went to all these places, including to Wanda Flannery in Denver, and sort of tracked John List's life as he sort of rebuilt it in the 18 years he was gone. And I went also to his house in Virginia and spoke briefly with his poor wife. I mean, this woman just the world tumbled in on her, and she didn't know what in the world to believe. She denied that it could have been John List, although it was becoming increasingly clear to her, obviously, that he was. She is dead now, as are many of the people involved in the story. He's tried. He has a public defender. It seems to me, and it's not a point I argued with any great authority, but it seems to me that a defense of John List in the trial there were several things that you could have argued for a mistrial, at least. One of them was the pollution, the disruption of the crime scene. The other was the fact that the fact that the kids and the drama coach had broken into that house and seen the crime scene before anyone else. That was not brought up in the trial. It was just obliquely mentioned that the drama coach had gone in with the police, not had led the police. And obviously he was guilty, and so good. I mean, fair trial notwithstanding, he was the guy that massacred his family, and he was found guilty. The news accounts, and at least there were several books, including mine. They all bought into the fact that he had done this horrible deed out of religious fervor, and I never ever bought that. I knew he was, I knew all about how religious he was, but this was not a cult. This was a mainstream religious organization he belonged to, and they were, in Westfield, New Jersey, they were just part of the community, and they were horrified that he was associated with them, including the pastor. They had to be pretty careful about how they were public with this. But my opinion was, and I think it's absolutely correct, John List was greedy. He was greedy all his life. He was a mama's boy. His mother bailed him out all the time. His father was dead. It was a strict upbringing, but he was really greedy. He thought the world owed himself a living. And I showed this by talking to previous employers and people who knew him, and the old cowboy who knew him in Denver, and his boss in the kitchen in Denver. This was a guy who thought the world owed him a living, and he didn't really produce. I mean, he had jobs that he busted out of because he was such a jerk. And when he got to Westfield, he still had the attitude that he was a lot more of an important fellow than he actually was. He was greedy, and I really believe this. Two things: that the daughter brought, he was sexually repressed. John List was. The daughter, when she came in, every time she came into the house, she brought the 1960s in with her, and she wasn't overt about it, but he felt that. She brought in feminine sexuality, and that's something that terrified John List. She brought in the anti-war movement, even though she wasn't part of it. She brought in secularism. She brought in the world when she came into that house. I think that was the trigger. The wife was bedridden. He was very angry about the wife's. He just didn't get along with his wife at this point. I believe that was the trigger that led him to decide this. He decided, I can do one thing. I can erase all these people from my life. These are baggage, and I can leave, and I can see if I could start a new life somewhere else. I believe that the daughter was the main motive that he massacred the family. He later wrote a book in prison, which angered me no end when I found out about it. He hooked up with a sort of a crackpot this sounds weird, but a crackpot ex-CIA agent, a guy who was well known as a CIA agent, a daring-do CIA agent who had media connections. And he and this CIA agent, who was also a World War II veteran, got together when John was in prison and wrote a self-published book. It's a horrible book. It's filled with typos, but it's a book in which John List basically blames everybody but himself for the massacre of his family. He referred to it as the tragedy, and he referred to the family as collateral damage. And his excuse in the book was, I was suffering from PTSD, and and my wife was mean to me. So, and the book just infuriated me when I read. I'm sorry about, I still get angry about this book that he and this crackpot CIA guy, ex-CIA guy, wrote, in which he just whines and wheedles and blames everybody for what happened except himself. So, I mean, that's where I left John List. He's dead. And at the end of the book, I quote Moms Mabley, a famous African-American comedian, who had a line in her act in which she said, "My mother always told me that you always say good about the dead." And then Mom's mentioned somebody who had died who she didn't like, and Mom said, "He's dead? Good." And that's how I ended the book.
Yeah, I did like how you ended the book that way.
John List, to this day, I'm fascinated by the John List story.
What year did your book, Death Sentence, The Inside Story of the John List Murders, come out?
Well, it originally came out in in paperback in 1990, and then it was republished with an epilogue that really brings things up to date in 2017. So the operative edition of that book is Death Sentence 2017, published by Open Road Media, and I was able to go back and clear up some things from 30 years ago, and also to write a rather lengthy and detailed epilogue in the book, in which that's where Moms Mabley appears. That's where the CIA guy appears. Their dreadful self-published book.
Was one of the reasons you added to your book because of that collateral damage book? Do you feel like you had to address that?
Because even in prison, after everybody knew what he did, he knew what he did. He then made all these phony excuses for it. And I'm a Vietnam veteran, and it annoyed me that List, and I'm well aware of PTSD and the number of my comrades from Vietnam who are suffering severe PTSD effects and trauma from physical and psychological damage. Really wounded veterans. And John List just sort of blithely parading around, calling himself, pretending that PTSD was the reason he killed his family, infuriated me in no end. And the fact that a CIA guy was helping him do that, it just made me mad. And so that's why that's in the epilogue.
Did you ever speak to that CIA or former CIA agent who helped author that book?
He's dead. He died before I read the book, or I would have tracked him down. His name was Austin Goodrich, and he's a real deal. I mean, he was a CIA guy back in the time in the 50s and 60s.
Did you ever speak to John List?
I did briefly when he was on trial, and he was snotty. He thought that I didn't have any right to ask him any questions, and he sort of blustered past me. So I spoke to him briefly, and then he wouldn't speak in prison. He did speak to Connie Chung, I think, in a TV interview, in which she just let him get away with murder. Giving his pathetic excuses for sending the family to heaven, that's just baloney. But that's the operative interview that's on the record, is the Connie Chung one of John List in prison, and of course the CIA guy.
There are two things that really strike me about the John List story, and one of them is the fact that he didn't need to kill his family. In 71, right. You can just disappear. I mean, how many people have stories where their dad went to get a pack of cigarettes and they never saw him again? That's
the cliche, yeah.
And so why kill your whole family?
That's a key question, Darren. And I believe, and I know enough about the daughter and John List. I believe that was that he in a rage decided to kill the daughter. Now, explain to me why anybody would be in a murderous rage. I don't know, but I really believe that partly explains it. And of course, the others were, in fact, in his twisted way of looking at it, once he eliminated the daughter and the wife, Now, notice that those are the two the feminine sexual elements in the house, not the mother. Uh, he massacred those two both, and the others had to go because they would have been witnesses. I'm sorry to laugh at that, but it's just John List is so perverse in my head.
It is.
So that's how I figure it.
And the other thing that strikes me about the John List case is that seems to be emotionless about this. I mean,
Yeah.
He planned it out, so he would be sitting around the table eating dinner with his family, who he knows in the back of his mind, I'm going to kill these people next week.
Yep.
And then
he did
to carry on with his life like nothing
that's
happened.
Right. That's exactly the kind of person he was. I forgot to mention, though, he did tell the kids, I guess 2 weeks before he killed them, he told them, get your conscience clear, say your prayers, because I'm going to kill you. Now, Patty, the girl, the teenage girl, told her, was in a panic, and told her drama coach about that in tears. And he said, "Oh, don't." Parents always say, "I'm going to kill you," to their kids, and he kind of blew her off. But she truly believed that the father had made a genuine warning to them that they were going to be killed, and I think the boys did too.
Because she was genuinely afraid of him, right? I mean, you had remarked in your book that he had called her a cheap. The jeans she was wearing made her look like a cheap slut, which isn't something I could see myself saying to my daughter.
Well, that's John List.
All right. Well, let's talk about some of the reason that people list him as a suspect for the DB Cooper hijacking. I think you and I both agree it wasn't John List, but for some reason it remains there. It's on the Wikipedia page, for example.
Well, I mean, the coincidence of the timing is gripping. And when I began to look into this, what was it, 30 years ago? I mean, I thought maybe there's a real case that this guy was DB Cooper. And then, as everybody else did, and yourself included, I'm sure, as you sort of poked at this, you realize, but it's fascinating because he looked so much like that police sketch of Dan Cooper, suit and tie. I mean, that's the thing. It was like, oh boy, there's a guy that's in a suit and tie. Who hijacks a plane in a suit and tie? Maybe more people do, but is that what you think of? There was the suit and tie. There was the timing, the similarity in the sketch and the photograph, and the fascination with this John List who disappeared into thin air. Like it was he was a reasonable suspect, and I totally understand why he was being looked at. But of course, we knew pretty quickly that number one, we ascertained when he was arrested that List had just moved, had transferred himself pretty quickly after a long bus ride to Denver. And we could find evidence that he rented this trailer, etc. The List clearly didn't have the kind of experience that Dan Cooper had to have had in executing this parachuting from an airplane, in knowing that the rear the 727 had a rear door contraption that could be opened in flight. Knowing that as I recall, Cooper mentioned, Cooper's very polite, as John List overtly was polite to people in a casual way. He mentioned after he had hijacked the plane, he mentioned to a flight attendant as they were circling Seattle. He looked out the window and he said that down there it looks like Tacoma, which of course is right next to Seattle. An indication that he knew the terrain. He knew apparently where to jump. He knew to tell the plane, the pilots, to fly at 10,000 feet at a fairly low. They weren't going fast; they were going pretty slow. So, I mean, those are things that John List had not a clue about avionics or anything like that, and had the fact that this meek kind of prissy John List would have had the guts to do what D.B. Cooper did is in hindsight you think that was even silly to think that could have been. I've always been fascinated by the fact that they found some of the money, in the wilds of what was it, Washington State? That
on the shores of the Columbia on Tina Bar, they found $5,800.
Yeah, right, and what were apparently marked bills or bills that you could have traced fairly easily. But that definitely was not John. We know where John List was at the time, and he was working as a cook's assistant in a Holiday Inn in Golden, Colorado. But it would have been a better book had it been true.
Yeah, definitely. I've got this question for you. I figured you could answer. D.B. Cooper wore a clip-on tie on the plane. Would John List wear a clip-on tie?
Oh yeah, he'd be the type. Yep, yes, he would. Yeah.
And then his military experience. There's nothing where he has airborne training or experience or anything like that.
Nope. His army experience was he went to Germany in almost the mop-up operation to the very, very end of World War II. He later made up some kind of goofy story about being captured, which was just an exaggeration of a fairly routine event. No, he had no significant combat or commando experience or anything. He was just a what's the phrase that Joe Biden used? He was a lion, two-faced dog pony.
Oh yeah, lion, two-faced dog pony.
Soldier. Yeah. And I'm sure John List never got on a pony in his life.
And D.B. Cooper was not wearing glasses until after he hands the stewardess the note. Then he puts on sunglasses. How was John List's sight?
John List would not be the sunglass type, but he always wore glasses. And no, he was definitely not the shades guy. People did notice all the time that he was in a suit and tie. I mean, mowing your lawn in a suit and tie will get you talked about by your neighbors, and he was known for that.
And I thought it was interesting. You mentioned a coworker talked about when he was living in Colorado that he had a lot of issues with his feet.
Yeah, I think that was chronic, like lumbago or whatever it is that you get in your feet. There wasn't any indication that he'd been injured. But again, that was there you go, another indication. Oh, John List had a foot problem, and if you parachute, you could have injured your ankle pretty easily. I once fell out of a helicopter at 4 feet, and I still have an ankle that hurts from that. I didn't have a parachute or anything. It was 4 feet. But another potential clue that there's your guy. What a story that would have been but by all accounts by what few accounts we have, D.B. Cooper was kind of liked, wasn't he, by the flight attendants?
He was. They said he was nice and polite.
Polite, yeah. I think John List was not. John List was polite when he had to be, but he was not. He would not have been known as a likable guy. Nobody liked this guy. A couple of people in Denver did, but they. I've never quite understood why. He was maybe on his best behavior when John List ended up in Denver for a while. I've always thought that the poor wife he married in Denver, that she was lucky she didn't get him too angry, given his record.
Yeah, he was already able to pull it off once. Why can't he do it a second time?
Oh, I don't mean to laugh. I'm sorry.
No, it's understandable. It's a crazy story.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, but what always struck me, Darren, as the strangest story of all, in that, besides the weirdness about John List and his ability to escape into thin air, was the kids, the drama club kids, all of whom knew that they knew that something horrible had happened, and knew days before the police arrived that the family had been massacred. How weird is that?
That is really weird. Why would you sit on that?
They were terrified. They number one, they had broken and entered. This was 1971. There was not a lot of trust between young people and the police. This was a relatively small town police department. I think it was a pretty good police, not a bad police department. I kind of get that, although it's weird. I mean, if it were me, the first thing I would have done would have been go tell. Look what I found. But I'm a reporter.
And I like that. I think it was Jean, one of the two Jeans. When you spoke to her, she thought it was laughable that John could pull off the D.B. Cooper caper.
Yeah, because if you knew him, it was like that. On the surface there were great similarities, but if you knew John List, it was like, nah, he's not going to jump out of any airplane. He was craven. When he shot his family, they didn't even see him coming. He was not known for bravery. He tried to make it like later on in this horrible book that I mentioned. He tried to make it like he had some kind of a brave combat experience. But I checked his records and I went over it carefully, and he did not. And I'm a veteran, so that's another reason why I'm a little steamed at John List to this very day.
I like that. I like that you're angry at John List.
It's been a long time, and I still am. You've triggered me now.
I apologize. Well, let's get off John List, and do you mind answering some
John List?
Well, let's get off the John List topic. Do you mind answering some D.B. Cooper questions?
Sure. I don't know very much about him, though.
Do you think D.B. Cooper survived the jump?
Oh, what a good question. I have no authority whatsoever on this except kibitzing. The thing that throws me into saying no is that some of the money was found. I can see Cooper obviously had some experience. He might have been ex-military. It's a good guess. He knew about the airplane. He knew about how to fly it. He knew about parachuting. What did he order? 4 parachutes, two real ones and two backup ones, and he left 2 on the plane. But so he knew. He didn't jump impulsively with no idea of how to parachute. Well, you don't do that unless somebody gives you a lesson or two. So he did that. Could he have? I mean, it was winter, right?
Yeah, it was November.
Yeah, but
in Portland.
Some guys can, rough and tough guys. They can do it. They can maybe escape on foot. But I was bothered. I'm just the fact that some of the money was found just indicates something. But why wasn't all the money found? So who knows? To this day, that's a fascinating story, and also a story that back in the days of hijacking. This was before hijack. We tend to think of hijacking as 9/11, but back in those days, hijacking was often you didn't have hijackers as a rule who were as polite and gentlemanly as D.B. Cooper, but generally hijacking was not done to kill the passengers. Passengers, by and large, were left off the plane or were not harmed while the hijacker went to. Often it was Cuba. There was no blowing up of planes until Antibes. So I'm struck by the fact that D.B. Cooper seemed to be not only congenial but thoughtful. I think I read that he paid for the drinks.
Yeah, paid for the drinks. He tried to leave a tip.
What a guy! Tried to leave a tip, right? And then the flight attendant courteously did not take the tip. I'm thinking like, well, that's sort of that's cordiality in the air.
And he asked for he asked for crews, or not crews. He asked for meals to be delivered to the crew because the event was taking so long.
He thought about them. So that ain't John List, Darren. That just ain't John List. Just that alone.
All right, Joe. So you have to bet on it. Does he survive the jump?
If I had to guess, I'd say yeah. And it makes it an even better story because maybe he's still alive. Although he'd be pretty old, wouldn't he?
He would be old. He'd be late 80s or 90s at
Yeah,
this point.
it's still going to happen. If he's in his late 80s, he's got a tale to tell, and he hasn't told it. So he'll take it to his grave.
Well, if he would like to tell it and you're listening, feel free to come on this show.
Okay. So you let me know if you crack the case, because I know that you're working hard. You've been working hard on it. You've got all the information. And it's just like, that's an even more interesting story than John List himself. What a mystery.
Do you think that D.B. Cooper's bomb was real?
Well, they saw the sticks. No, because if you know anything about dynamite, you don't screw around with, what was it, 8 sticks of dynamite? You don't do that. And he would have been smart enough to know that. It was probably not, And there was no indication that he was going to blow up an airplane.
Yeah, I agree. I think most everyone believes that the bomb isn't real. What reason would there be to have a real bomb?
Well, he was a nice guy. Why would he have a real bomb? And why would he be carrying dynamite, which is dangerous?
Right. It's impolite to carry a bomb.
It's impolite. It's not courteous. It was courteous. That's a clue. The guy is going to be courteous when you find him. He's going to be old and courteous. He won't blow you up.
What do you think of the fact that in the D.B. Cooper case, there are 2 different sketches that have been circulated around, and they look different?
Well, it's sketch artists interview people, and then they sort of just wing it. So whoever their flight attendants, basically flight attendants who had the eye on him, had the eyeballs on him, and I think there's probably competing sketch artists. It's probably a very competitive business, just like the sculptor.
Why do you think the D.B. Cooper case is still unsolved?
Well, it's still first of all, he was very clever about it. He did the deed in the dead of night in really rough mountainous terrain. A place where you could if you were in good shape and lucky, you could definitely get by. There weren't a lot of cops who would have been in the area. Then aerial surveillance would have been pretty much useless. And I recalled recently an HBO series on the famous escape of 2 guys from Dannemora prison in upstate New York, and how they actually, not only how they cleverly managed to get somebody to help them escape, but how they survived for a while in the wilds of sort of mountainous upstate New York. And I thought, well, that's not as difficult as it may appear if you're lucky and if you're in reasonably good shape. I wouldn't attempt to do it without a horse, but what do I know?
Do you think the D.B. Cooper case will be solved?
Do you? No, I don't. Do you?
I really don't know. I hope
but
it does.
If it's going to be solved, Darren, you're going to do it.
I don't know if
so
I'm
going to do
it.
So you let me know, huh? Give me a call.
Do you have a favorite suspect for Dan Cooper, for D.B. Cooper?
Nah. John List, but that was just wishful thinking.
Right. He's your favorite suspect, even though it's not him.
No, he was not. No, I don't follow it. I haven't followed it closely enough to, I've seen the suspects that you've on your webpage, and they all look pretty good to me. Some of them have obviously been ruled out, but there's some that's like, I don't know. Who's yours?
I really don't know. When I first heard about D.B. Cooper, the first report or the first account of it I really looked into was pushing this guy Kenny Christensen as D.B. Cooper. And then as I became more interested in it, he wasn't as viable as a suspect as I had found out. So I've sort of learned there's all these kind of like suspect peddlers, if you want to call them that.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And when you read their account, it's like, okay, that's the guy. I don't know how many people have come up to me and said, oh, I know who D.B. Cooper is. It's Kenny Christensen or it's Robert Rackstraw, because they've only looked into that person's account of what happened.
Right. Yeah.
So,
but you've got somewhere on that list, I think, is the guy. It's just a matter of figuring out which one of those guys. Good luck.
Yeah, exactly.
The flight attendants are, I guess are no longer. Well, they could be alive, but they had very little information besides what we already know.
Yeah, I think they're tired of being harassed by people.
Can you
about
imagine
the
what it
case
must have
and
been like for
talking about
them?
it.
Yeah. So Cooper hits the ground with 2 bourbons in him, which is not enough to make me jump out of an airplane. But he's got 2 bourbons, and it's dark and it's cold. So I don't know if he had good shoes. I hope so. I'm sure he did.
Well, he boarded the plane with loafers on. So.
Did he really?
Yeah, he did.
Did he? Is that after the hijacking? Did he still have loafers on?
Yeah, he never asked for boots or anything.
You can't go through the mountains in loafers.
I like that. That's what made you change your mind. Yeah, he might have survived. Oh no, loafers. He didn't make it.
I got boots. Well, I live in the desert. I got boots.
All right, Joe. Is there anything we haven't covered?
No. That's. Thank you for that. That's been a very interesting and a fun conversation. So thanks so much. Thank you for reading the book. And thank you for triggering the John List rage back in me. It's going to take me days to come down from that, man.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on. It's something that's
my pleasure.
I wanted to do on the show because, like I said, it's listed on the Wikipedia page, and I have people bring it up from time to time. And I just think anyone that has a real knowledge of Cooper or John List, it's just it's not even plausible, really.
Ain't John List, I wish it had been. If he'd had the $200,000, John List, he would have spent it pretty quickly.
Oh yeah, I got that from reading your book also, that he liked to live kind of above his means.
He was not a frugal guy. He just didn't have any money. All right, Darren, it's been a great pleasure.
Absolutely. The pleasure was all mine. Thanks again for coming on.
You.
If there is anywhere where people have a question for you or they want to reach you, is there somewhere they can do that?
Sharkey123, JSHARKEY123 @gmail.com.
Perfect. Thanks again for coming on, Joe. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
If you have questions or comments for Joe, you can hit him up at jsharkey123 @gmail.com or find him at his website, joesharkey.com. Make sure you pick up a copy of his book, Death Sentence, The Inside Story of the John List Murders. Is there a suspect we haven't covered yet? Or someone you think we should have on the show? Let us know. You can find us on Facebook. We are The Cooper Vortex. Instagram @The Cooper Vortex. On Twitter @DB Cooper Podcast. Or email us, dbcooperpodcast@gmail.com. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a review. Thank you to Joe Sharkey for taking the time to talk with me about John List and DB Cooper. Thank you for Russell Colbert for taking the time to listen to me talk about DB Cooper. I'm Darren Schaefer, and thank you for listening to the Cooper Vortex.